I don't know. I'm just gonna ramble a little bit, talk about science, talk about spirituality, whatever comes to mind. You know, um, I think when it comes to topics of science and spirituality, oftentimes we don't see those two fields blended together. Oftentimes the it seems as if the religious community feels as if science is the enemy, and vice versa. When you talk to the scientific mind, they oftentimes look at religion as religion being the enemy. But I'm of the opinion that the two go together. They both have something to offer to the mind. In fact, I believe that you can't truly understand either field without knowledge of its opposite, right? You can't truly understand religion in its fullness if you don't have at least a basic understanding of science, right? And vice versa on the scientific end, you're never truly gonna understand the physical world if you do not understand the religious and mythological aspects. And what I mean by that, because I know a lot of people will say, what does religion, what does myth have to do with physics, excuse me, and science? And my argument to that would be, if you look at a lot of the religious stories, the myths, and things like that you find that were written long ago, um, what you discover is that you had very intelligent men and women that were writing in code, very, very um, profound messages about the nature of the universe that they were encoding not only in their mythological stories and folklore, but also in their symbolism, in their architecture, in their music, in the culture and the language, in the writings such as the hieroglyphics and things of that nature. you know all of this, they were encoding this message in everything that they did. And what we're beginning to discover now, that man has discovered quantum mechanics, and we're able to study the physical world on a much smaller level. We're beginning to realize that on a fundamental level, the natural world doesn't move any differently than what our ancient ancestors were saying, again, thousands of years ago, when they drew the symbol of the yin and the yang. I mean, that right there, that duality seeking balance, we find that pattern all throughout the universe. In fact, we find that there's a one fundamental constant, being the wave pattern. As we see here, the wave function symbol, the size symbol, that is a fundamental constant throughout the entire universe, where you have these two equal but opposite energies that are always seeking balance and then repulsion from one another, right? They come together and then they repulse, they separate, and then they're attracted back together, and then they repulse and they separate. And this is a fundamental constant throughout all the universe, right? And we know this as we study the physical world more and more and more. We begin to see this pattern is just, it's nonstop. It's everything. Not only is it in the makeup of the physical world, but it also seems to be in the behavior of life itself. Whether we're talking about insect life or animal life, sea life, plant life, human beings being incorporated in that animal life. Everything kind of seems to move according to this behavior as well. The coming together and then the repulsion. You know what I mean? The coming together of the male and the female in order to bring forth life, but that is a new living being, a new male or a new female that comes forth, and that new male and that new female eventually repulses, goes off from the family to start their own family, and life, emerges and grows in that way. And so, it's not just a fundamental constant in the basic materials of life. Again, it's a fundamental constant in the behavior, the behavioral patterns of nature, and even, dare I say, the psychological pattern of man and woman as well, and how we think and process information. So it is it is interesting to again now see that as a truth in physics, but also realizing that again, this is something that our ancestors were well aware of long ago, and again, they incorporated it in their lifestyles, in their symbology. The Ankh being another one, where we have Isis, the feminine, being the seated shape oval on top, and then we have Osiris, which is the vertical line symbolizing the erected penis, the obelisk, right? And then you have the horizontal line, which is Horus, symbolizing the child, which is a 50-50 genetic representation of both the father and the mother, right? So you have the high wave, the low wave, and then you have the balance between the two. You know what I mean? And the balance between the two neutralizes one another, because the child is both genetically father and mother, but at the same time, the child is its own being. It is neither the father nor the mother, you know. And again, we see this pattern where we have these two equal but opposite energies that are separate and apart from one another. And then when they come together, they they neutralize one another. So if we're talking about water waves, when they come together, when the trough and the crest come together, you get stillness. If we're talking about sound waves, if you have a high and a low wave, they come together, you get silence. If we're talking about light wave, the high and the low, they come together, you get darkness. Whenever these two equal but opposite energies, positive and negative, male or female, light, dark, whenever they come together, they they neutralize one another. So in that moment, you get everything and nothing simultaneously, right? In that moment, you have everything and nothing simultaneously, because you have both of these energies, their total energy has now come together. But when that happens, you get a complete cancellation of everything. It goes still, right? So you have everything and nothing entangled in that moment at the same time. It is a state of superposition. If you're familiar at all with quantum mechanics and how nature works on the microscopic scale, where a particle exists both as a particle, but also it can exist as a wave, where it's neither here nor there until you attempt to observe it or measure it. It's really kind of freaky when you think about it. If you're not familiar with quantum mechanics, I would encourage you definitely to check out some videos on YouTube. Some of it's kind of far fetched. You got to take your time with it. It is it's a lot of new terminology if you're not, someone that's fascinated with science or familiar with science at all. So, it'll take a little while maybe to get used to some of the lingo. But once you get used to some of the basic terminology, you'll find that the field of quantum mechanics is actually extremely fascinating. It's very, very interesting. Highly, I would encourage anybody, if you're interested in spirituality, if you're interested in mythology, if you're interested in philosophy, you should by all means um, look into quantum mechanics. At least just dabble into it a little bit, because you'll be surprised to see how many parallels, there are between the two. So yeah, when the waves, when these two equal but opposite forces, when they come together, they neutralize one another. In that moment, you have everything and nothing at the same time. It's complete balance, it's complete stillness. Nikola Tesla spoke about this and kind of made reference to this when he spoke of the three, the six, and the nine. I'm not going to touch too much into that today. Hopefully, if I do another one of these, we'll cover the 369, in detail. There are some videos on YouTube that talk about it a little bit, but I don't think anybody really goes too deep into it as far as drawing the parallel between the three, six, and nine and the movement of the wave function and how numerically the three, six, and nine is actually a numeric wave function. So if I do a video again, talking about that in the near future, hopefully I will, But anyways, hopefully I'll do a video in the future where I talk about that in a little more detail because it really is fascinating. The number 369 is really, really fascinating. In fact, they have a magic square called the magic square of the moon, which is a really, really fascinating magic square. If you're familiar with magic squares at all, they're not magic really. They're just a mathematical square, even sides, usually like 9 by 9 or 3 by 3 or whatever it may be, And what's fascinating about the square is each row, no matter how you add it up horizontally or vertically, you will get the same answer for every single row in every single column. Again, going horizontally and going vertically, and also going the long way diagonally. You'll always get the same number when you add up all the numbers. And in the 369 magic square, that number is 369. So no matter what row, what column, really fascinating. Something you can look up on YouTube. The magic squares, they're really, really interesting. They've been around for centuries. A lot of people would encode them in their paintings and their art and stuff like that to make their artwork more fascinating, but also to encode esoteric messages within the paintings for people who were quote unquote in the know to kind of be able to look at the painting and get, whereas most people would look at a painting and not pick up on these encoded messages within the art. Dan Brown in his book Da Vinci Code, of course, he teased on that a little bit. Some would speculate in his book some of his breakdowns are a little sketchy. I can't really remember, I've read the book a long time ago, saw the movie a long time ago, so I can't really remember. I'd have to go back and look at it myself. But the premise of it is definitely true that our ancestors, that's what they did. Everything was about encoding this very sacred message, in everything that you did. It was a part of your culture because essentially what you wanted a human being to grow up into the awareness of who and what they actually are. And when you gain that understanding, there are certain abilities that you eventually acquire with that kind of knowledge, which is just how life works, right? Until you know something, you can't really access, its possibilities. For example, electricity, right? Electricity's been around before man was around, right? It's been around since man was around, but it wasn't until man discovered it, quote unquote, that they were able to actually take it and manipulate it and use it in ways that are useful in the many various ways that we use it today. But the electricity itself was always existent. What didn't exist was the knowledge. So once man became aware of something, they were able to take that awareness and use it to their advantage. So it's the same thing with spiritual knowledge, with mental knowledge. When a person comes into the awareness of who and what they actually are, they theoretically, right, should develop and begin to acquire certain abilities that allow them to do things that they weren't able to do when they did not have such knowledge. And so our ancestors, of course, being privy of that, would encode these messages and symbols and things like that within the stories to make you aware of who and what you actually are. This is the very reason why our Egyptian, our Kemetic ancestors would write on their temples and on their schools and their buildings before you would cross the threshold. You would have up on the top of the threshold the saying, "Man, know thyself." That was extremely important to our Kemetic ancestors. Was man know thyself, not man know thy neighbor, not man know the deep sayings of Confucius. Or, man know thyself. Man know thyself. Know who and what you are, because with that knowledge, you know, sky's the limit, really. Um, and so again, that was very important to our ancestors, and they stressed that even in the movie The Matrix. If you guys are familiar with the movie The Matrix, episode one, the Oracle, she points out to Neo, over her threshold, coming into her kitchen from that little hallway or living room area, what have you, she had the same sign, but she had it written in Greek, but it was the same thing: man, know thyself. If you're familiar with The Matrix, you know that movie is heavily entrenched in a lot of philosophy and esoteric mysteries. Great movie. They do a great job with, in my opinion at least, they do a great job with just the way they lay out the content, and they cover a lot of the esoteric mysteries, and they cover the hero's journey, which is essential to most of the mysteries and myths and folklore that our ancestors left behind. Was the hero's journey. Joseph Campbell writes about that in his wonderful book, the Hero with a Thousand Faces, which is a great book. Might be a little hard to digest if you're not familiar with mythology and religion or what have you, because Joseph Campbell, he dances around beautifully, quite a bit. But if you're not familiar with again, with mythology, religion, and things like that, it might be a bit much. I know it was for me about 20 something years ago when I first tried to pick up the book. I had caught a special that they were given on PBS many years ago with it was called a special called The Power of Myth, where I think it was Bill Moyer that was interviewing Joseph Campbell. And the I think the interview happened like in the 80s, but the interview was so successful and it was so popular that it became this thing that PBS would just run yearly, and they probably still do it, and I had caught it, maybe about 20 years ago, so right at the turn of the century or what have you. And it was like perfect timing for me because I was just kind of coming out of that whole Christian church mentality and starting to kind of broaden my horizons a little bit, as far as how I, looked at spirituality, and starting to question why I was a Christian. Was I a Christian by choice, or was I a Christian by indoctrination, and having to go through that whole kind of self introspective, figuring your shit out type thing. And it was during that time that I had stumbled upon that Power Myth special where Bill Moyer and Joseph Campbell were talking, and he was just kind of explaining where I was at that moment, and I kind of related with what he was saying. And long story short, they actually made that interview was so successful that they made the interview into a two-part book. I want to say one part or two-part. But I got the book, and because I liked the interview so much, I had to get the book, and I read the book, a couple of times, and yeah, that prompted me to go and get Joseph Campbell's Hero with a Thousand Faces. That's where I was going. Yeah, I know I took you all around the block, but I do that sometimes, so please bear with me. Anyway, so yeah, I got that book back then, but again, just not really being familiar with mythology. I was very familiar with Christianity. My background was Christianity. I spent about 8 years as a Hebrew Israelite. And if you know anything about the Hebrew Israelites, especially back then, and what really attracted me to that organization is we were studious. We didn't just go to a building and listen to one guy, preach. for 3 hours. You went to a class where there was a desk and you were expected to take notes and to ask questions, and so you really had to know your shit, when you were there. And so you learned a lot in a short span of time, and you went over it all the time. So you felt as though you were really well versed in the scriptures. What I later discovered as I evolved was I was really well versed within the context of that doctrine. You know what I mean? But as far as having an expanded view of the history of Christianity and just different religions in general, there was still a lot for me to learn, in regards to religion, and then in regards to mythology. And at this point, I was more familiar with a very orthodox form of Christianity, but not so much mythology. And so when I picked up the book, Joseph Campbell's A Hero with a Thousand Faces, when I picked up that book, it was difficult for me to grasp. But if you give yourself some time with that book, and if you kind of delve into mythology, and you acclimate yourself a little bit with religion, you will find that there's a lot of good information in that book. A lot of good information about the hero's journey. And again, that's extremely important to the ancestors, and they make sure that in just about all of your folklore and all of your mythology, you've got that hero's journey, you know. Um, where, again, if you want to borrow from Joseph Campbell and the monomyth structure, the hero journey breaks down as the separation, the initiation, and then the return, the three main parts of the hero's journey. And that's a good way to break it down, because that essentially does cover the hero's journey. You could extend it out a little bit into broader steps, but if you're just giving it a gist overview, yeah, that's a good overview of the hero's journey that you find, whether we're talking about the story of Osiris, Isis, and Horus, or if you're talking about the story of Christ, if you're talking about, Cronus and Zeus, and, different mythologies that you read about all throughout, you have the hero's journey. And you even find the hero's journey encoded in real life, right? Not just the myth, but if you look at the life of Malcolm X, so if you look at the life of Martin Luther King, you find the same thing, the hero's journey. The parallels between Malcolm X and Jesus Christ are astounding in some ways. You know what I mean? With just the lifestyles that they lived and what they became, and then their ultimate demise, so to speak, and their ability to kind of continue to resonate after they leave the body. You know what I mean? So it's fascinating to see the parallels between characters like, Christ and Malcolm X and Martin Luther King, and, other people that have, lived in our day and age, or, relatively, and, have walked that same hero's journey in real life. You know what I mean? So it doesn't just play out in the myth. It also, again, it's one of those things that, as I mentioned before, you see it play out in the behavior and psychology of human beings. So I can ramble, and, I don't want to ramble on too much because, you know, I don't want to bore you. But again, really what I wanted to talk about and address just today just is covering that wave symbol and covering the wave function, and just stressing how important that pattern is. And if I do more discussions like this, because I have a tendency to like do a video and then like not do another one for months, so hopefully if I stay consistent with it and I do another video, um, yeah, we'll talk a little bit. Pretty much everything that I talk about is going to be founded on the wave function. I can get into some really, really complex things. I mean, there's a lot that we can talk about, you know what I mean? And a lot of it deals with science, and some of it deals with mythology and religion. And we deal with philosophy, and we can talk physics, we can talk music, we can talk geometry, we can talk math, we can talk biology, chemistry, astrology, cosmology. all of these things we can talk about, and they all come back to this simple function right here, the wave function. Nothing can escape the wave function. We can even get into history and psychology and all of it, psychiatry. It all comes back to this wave function. So everything that I talk about, if I continue to do these videos, will basically be founded on that one principle. So you'll hear me revert back or come back to the wave function quite often, because nothing deviates from that pattern. It's like what Morpheus said in Matrix Part 4, if you guys caught that. He said he saw that pattern, right? And he was like, once he saw the pattern, he began to see it everywhere. And I promise you, it really is like that. Once you see it, you can't unsee it. You know what I mean? Once you see the pattern and you really catch on to what the pattern is, it becomes this thing that you just can't stop seeing, and it opens you up psychologically to an entirely new world. It is quite fascinating. I know there are some people that have experienced it, so I'm not alone in that. You know what I mean? I'm not sitting here trying to profess I'm the only one that has had the experience as well. It is an experience that is not common. It's not something that I think the masses experience. I think it's more it's more unique. You know what I mean? Because it's one of those things that you really do have to press for. And and it's not like you get enlightenment, or you discover something and then it's like, oh, you got it, and then you're never there. That truth is something that is eternal. It's always growing, it's always expanding. So there's no there, so to speak. There's always room for more to learn and what have you. It's a constant that's the movement or flow of life itself, is that constant eternal learning. So anyways, again, I can ramble, I can go on and on. So anyways, we're gonna go ahead, we're gonna wrap it up there, and hopefully we do this again soon. Peace.